There is something about Rome that no marketing campaign has ever been able to fully explain, and no tourist brochure has ever been brave enough to admit. It is not the grandeur. Every city has had grandeur. It is not the history. History is everywhere. What makes Rome singular is the particular quality of its falling. Rome does not decline the way other cities decline. It declines the way the original empire declined, slowly, elaborately, with a kind of tragic dignity, until one day you look up and realize the scaffolding was never about restoration. It was about holding the whole thing together. If you want to watch that process in real time, before the rest of the world catches on, subscribe, because Empire Falls documents the collapse that mainstream media prefers to frame as renovation. 2,777 years. That is how old Rome is. The oldest functioning capital in Western civilization. The city that gave the world its legal system, its architectural vocabulary, its calendar, its concept of what a city is supposed to be. At its height, the Roman Empire administered over 70 million people across 3 continents. The Colosseum seated 50,000. The aqueducts delivered over 300 million gallons of fresh water every single day. The road network stretched over 250,000 miles, and every one of those roads pointed back to the same place. And for the past several centuries, Rome has been living off the interest of that inheritance. The interest, it turns out, is running out. Walk through Rome today, and 2 things will immediately strike you. The first is the sheer weight of what the city still carries. The layered millennia of stone and marble and empire pressed into every street corner, every piazza, every crumbling arch. The second is something harder to name but impossible to ignore. A kind of strain. A sense that something enormous is being asked of something that was never designed to carry this many people, this many tour buses, this many short-term rentals, this many cameras. Rome was built as a capital. It is now operating as a theme park. And the difference between those 2 functions is destroying it. We will trace this collapse in 4 chapters. The first is about the physical city itself. What is crumbling and why the cracks are not accidental. The second is about what has replaced Rome's actual inhabitants and what that substitution costs. The third is about the deeper economic machinery driving the decay, the one the tourist economy exists to conceal. And the fourth, the one that will change how you look at every great city in the world, is about what happens when an empire falls for the second time on the same ground. But before we go deeper, consider this question. What does a city look like in the year before everyone realizes it is falling? Not in a year of war or catastrophe, in a year of record tourism, in a year of Jubilee, in a year when the official story says the eternal city is more eternal than ever. It looks exactly like this. In November 2025, a medieval tower near the Colosseum partially collapsed. Not in a storm, not in an earthquake, during a renovation. The Torre dei Conti, commissioned by Pope Innocent III and built in the early 13th century, simply gave way while workers were inside it. One of them, a 66-year-old man named Octav Stroici, was trapped for hours before rescue workers finally pulled him through a window. He died in hospital soon after. The collapse was described by archaeologist Tom Rankin as a miracle and a warning. A miracle that no passers-by were killed by the falling debris. A warning about something the city had been ignoring for a long time. The Torre dei Conti is not an isolated case. It is a symbol. Rome's infrastructure problem is systemic, generational, and, in the cruelest of ironies, made worse by the very tourists who fund the renovation budgets. The Metro Sea Line, the new subway artery cutting under the historic center, is a nearly €3 billion project that, according to Chief Engineer Andrea Ciotti, will not be completed until 2034. Work began years ago. The vibrations from the deep drilling can be felt and heard across the surrounding neighborhoods. Investigators looking into the Torre dei Conti collapse were specifically examining whether those vibrations were a contributing factor. In the meantime, tram lines were disrupted, metro stations shut, and the historic center of Rome, one of the most photographed square kilometers on Earth, spent all of 2024 looking like a construction site. Piazza Navona, Ponte Sant'Angelo, Piazza della Repubblica, Fountain of the Four Lions, all of them behind scaffolding or barriers for most of the year. The Trevi Fountain, perhaps the most iconic image of Rome in the world, was drained for restoration, replaced temporarily by a small pool where tourists could still throw coins. Visitors posted mockery across social media. The city's response was to proceed as if the mockery proved nothing. Celia Wysocka, a journalist who has covered Rome for more than 2 decades, said at the end of 2024, "Rome is not ready, it is chaotic. Romans are mad. I hear it every time I get on the bus." That is not a journalist with an agenda. That is a reporter who has watched the same city for 20 years, describing a change she can no longer ignore. There is a parallel here that Rome, of all cities, should be able to see. The original empire's infrastructure collapse did not happen overnight. As imperial resources dwindled and leadership became less focused on the utilitarian needs of the empire, the systematic maintenance of infrastructure began to falter. Roman roads deteriorated, aqueducts silted up, public buildings fell into disrepair. Essential repairs were postponed, leading to structural weaknesses and eventual collapse. The process took generations, but it started exactly the way it is starting now, with deferred maintenance, insufficient funding, and a government more interested in the symbolism of grandeur than the mechanics of survival. Rome, in the 21st century, is not the empire anymore, but it is repeating the pattern with an almost deliberate fidelity. This, however, is only the surface layer of the decay. The stones tell one story, the people tell another. In 2024, Rome welcomed approximately 22.2 million tourists, a nearly 6% increase from the year before. The Jubilee year of 2025 was projected to bring up to 35 million. By any traditional metric, those numbers represent success. Rome is more visited than ever. And yet, ask a Roman resident how they feel about the city, and the answer is not gratitude. It is exhaustion, and in many cases, it is departure. Short-term rentals in Rome increased by 37.3% in a single year, making Rome the second highest city in Europe for this kind of growth, behind only Amsterdam. More than 25,000 properties are now listed on short-term rental platforms in the city. The consequence is not subtle. Rent now averages €2,000 a month, in a city where the average monthly salary is €2,367. That means the average Roman worker is spending nearly their entire income before food, transport, or anything else just to afford a roof over their head in the city where they were born. Finding a single flat for under €700 in Rome's suburbs, which are already poorly served by public transport, has become essentially impossible. One journalist, Simone Aliva, was forced to leave the apartment he had lived in for 13 years to make way for a new holiday rental. He directly blamed the Jubilee and the political response to it for this outcome. He is not alone. Locals are being pushed to the city's outskirts, while overpriced apartments in the historic center are snapped up by tourists, expats, and international students. Property owners have simply calculated that it is far more lucrative to lease by the night than to commit to long-term tenants. The math is not complicated. The consequences are. What you end up with is a city that is increasingly inhabited by people who are not from it, not invested in it, and will not be there when the bills come due. The residents who built the culture that attracts the tourists are being priced out of the city by the tourists they attracted. This is a pattern that has played out before. In Venice, it reached completion. The permanent population of Venice has fallen from 170,000 in the 1950s to fewer than 50,000 today. Rome is further back on that timeline, but it is on the same timeline. And the young people who might arrest the decline are not staying. More than 1 million Italians have left the country in the past 10 years, a third of them aged 25 to 34. Italy's youth unemployment rate sits above the European average. Salaries in Rome and across Italy do not rise in line with education. For every young foreigner who comes to settle in Italy, nearly 9 young Italians leave. A 24-year-old Roman graduate named Elena Picardi, interviewed late in 2024, described returning to Rome after studying in France, only to find that Italian job offers were either vague about salary or significantly below what the same role would pay elsewhere in Europe. "Why should I sacrifice my prospects?" she asked. "When my profile is more valued abroad?" That question is being asked by tens of thousands of young Romans, every year, and the city offers no compelling answer. What is left behind when the young and educated leave? When the residents are displaced? When the infrastructure strains under tourist weight? What remains is the shell, the magnificent, ancient, crumbling shell. What we have traced so far, the deteriorating medieval tower near the Colosseum, the 22 million annual visitors crowding into a city whose infrastructure was not designed for them, the residents forced out of apartments that have been converted into tourist rentals, the young graduates leaving for cities where their education is actually valued, the scaffolding on every iconic piazza, and beneath it all the slow accumulation of deferred repairs and postponed decisions. This is only one face of a pattern that runs through every empire entering its dusk. I gathered the full framework. The early warning signals most people miss. The 4 global forces behind what you are watching. And the calm playbook for what it means for your own decisions in the decade ahead, into a guide called When Everything Falls. The link is in the description, and you can also scan the code on your screen right now. But stay with me, because the deepest layer of Rome's decline is the one that history will record above all the others, and you will not find it in the tourism statistics. In October 2025, the Antico Cafe Greco closed its doors forever. It had been open since 1760. For 265 years, it had served coffee on Via dei Condotti at the foot of the Spanish Steps. Goethe had sat there, Byron had sat there, Keats, Stendhal, Mark Twain, Hans Christian Andersen. Buffalo Bill had taken his morning coffee there in 1890 with a group of cowboys. Pablo Picasso, Audrey Hepburn, Orson Welles, Sophia Loren. The artist Giorgio de Chirico, who lived nearby, once said of it, "The Cafe Greco is the best place to wait for the end of the world." It had survived papal schisms, European wars, fascism, the German occupation. What it did not survive was a real estate dispute. The building's owner had demanded the monthly rent rise from €18,000 to €120,000. The cafe's managers offered €800,000 a year. They offered €10 million to buy the building outright. Both offers were rejected. In July 2024, Italy's Supreme Court of Cassation ruled in the landlord's favor. The eviction was enforced. The portraits were stripped from the walls. The plush red velvet chairs, the gilded porcelain tableware, the seating booths where Casanova had allegedly made his arrangements, all carried out and placed in storage. By November 2025, curious tourists were peering through the windows at an empty room with the lights still on and no one making coffee. Think about what that image represents. Not sentimentally, but structurally. A cafe that survived more than 2.5 centuries of the most violent disruptions in European history was ended not by a catastrophe, but by a rent calculation. The cultural memory of a civilization traded for a higher yield tenancy. The new tenant, whoever they are, will serve coffee in a famous room, but the reason the room was famous will be gone. This is how empires hollow out, not in fire, in spreadsheets. But the Cafe Greco is not the end of this story. It is the illustration of a mechanism. And the mechanism is this. Rome has become a city that extracts value from its history without reinvesting in the conditions that make that history meaningful. The tourists come for the culture, the art, the authentic Roman experience. But the economic logic of over-tourism actively destroys all three. Roughly 70% of international tourists in Italy concentrate on only 1% of the country's territory. The pressure that concentrates on Rome is, by any measurement, extraordinary. The focus on catering to tourist tastes leads to the decline of traditional crafts and local food cultures as businesses shift toward more tourist-friendly services. The city that once exported civilization to the known world is now importing €5 gelato shops and souvenir stands as fast as its historic institutions can be displaced. A Rome-based professor, and one of the country's leading experts in the city's history, when asked about the situation in 2024, used a specific word. Not challenge, not transformation. He called it, without any hesitation, a plague. There is a question that historians ask about every fallen empire, and it is always the same question. At what point did the people who lived through it realize what was happening? The answer, almost always, is late. Usually too late. The Roman citizens of the 4th century did not experience their era as decline. They experienced it as complexity, as bureaucratic friction, as the rising cost of things that used to be cheaper, as a vague sense that the city no longer quite worked the way it once had, as the slow disappearance of institutions that had seemed permanent. Sound familiar? The cracks in modern Rome are not metaphors. They are literal. In the stones of towers that collapsed during renovation, in the faces of residents who cannot afford to stay, in the empty chairs of a cafe that served every great mind of the last 3 centuries, in the scaffolding that covers the fountains and the facades and the arches that the rest of the world comes to see. The eternal city is not eternal. No city is. That is the lesson Rome has been trying to teach the world for 2,000 years. We keep coming as tourists. We keep leaving before the lesson lands. But here is the pattern that history remembers. Every city that entered this phase had a moment when it still could have turned the corner. A moment when the economic incentives, the political will, and the cultural consciousness aligned closely enough that a different future was possible. Venice reached that moment in the 1970s and chose the wrong direction. Detroit reached it in the 1960s and did not recognize it at all. Rome is at that moment right now. The question is not whether Rome is falling. The evidence on that is clear. The question is whether Rome is the last of a certain kind of city or the first of a new kind of collapse. The one that happens to places so old, so magnificent, so deep in the world's imagination that nobody thinks to look for the signs until the tower is already coming down. Empires do not fall in a day. They fall in patterns. The Romans who watched the aqueducts slow and the roads crack and the legions thin did not call it decline. They called it administration. They called it economics. They called it the natural complexity of governing a great civilization. It took centuries before anyone wrote the history. We do not have centuries. The pattern is happening now, in the city that invented the concept of empire, on the same stones where the original fall was first rehearsed. If you want to watch the next chapter of this story, before the world catches up to what it is watching, subscribe. Empire Falls. And the next city we document is already in the process of proving it.